heterodoxy in the post-war era.
Thank you very much. I, like so many other speakers, want to extend my thanks for the invitation to present at this wonderful occasion. I'm very proud of the volume that has been produced under Olival's leadership and all the other hard work that's been put in. I was originally invited. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. Is that coming across? No, it's fine. It's fine. I was originally invited to perhaps contribute something on decoherence, but I instead suggested I do something on orthodoxy, and Olival very kindly acquiesced to my request. And so this is, I'll give you a little bit of the problematic. I'm taking a historian's perspective. This opens up a number of historiographical problems in telling the history of quantum mechanics. This has become the subject of a big work that I'm close to finishing, hopefully, on a history of the orthodoxy and eventually its unravelling. So, let me just begin. I'm afraid my presentation is a little quotation heavy, but you'll see the reason I'm doing this. Let's begin with a few basic views. Let's start with Dougal Murdoch's work on philosophy of physics, a very commonly held view that Bohr's conception of quantum mechanics forms the basis of the orthodox interpretation, or what's commonly called the Copenhagen Interpretation. He published this in 1987, but you could find many such views today. What about Ravi Gottman, who more recently, in line with the work of Don Howard, whose wonderful chapter you'll find in the book, has argued very persuasively that Bohr's own interpretation was fundamentally different from and even opposed to the Copenhagen interpretation in virtually all its particulars. Clearly we have something funny going on here. More recently again, Jan Fay and Henry False, in the introduction to their ninth volume on Bohr and the philosophy of physics, have argued that recent scholarship has gone a long way to demonstrating that the many versions of the so-called orthodox or Copenhagen interpretation were often inconsistent with each other, and that there was no uniform agreement among all the diverse physicists and some philosophers who considered themselves to be supporting the Copenhagen point of view. I wholeheartedly endorse this last view. In fact, it has become increasingly clear to me that the Copenhagen interpretation as a term is much more of a hindrance than a help when we write the history of quantum mechanics. I'm certainly not alone in this view. Certainly Don Howard has echoed similar things. The question then becomes, it's so deeply penetrated our discourse, whether at this conference or one event, we find it very hard to speak about the history of quantum mechanics without referencing the Copenhagen interpretation. So I set myself the task to write a whole book on the orthodoxy in which I make no use of the concept, although I will use the term, right, as an actor's category. There was no consensus reached after the 1927 Solvay Conference. And I don't just mean that Du Bois, Einstein and Schrödinger left disenchanted. They realised they were kind of they were the vanquished, not the victors. But even among the others, if you read the proceedings, Born, Heisenberg, Bohr, Pauli, there's no manifesto that comes out afterwards. Here are the central tenets. If you look at Bohr's Como lecture, of which he gave bits and pieces of at the conference, there's no mention of mutually exclusive experimental arrangements. That would come later. And here, I know Alexei will be coming up, but I want to quote him from a very nice chapter he contributed some years ago. Not only do we find differences, okay, but we find people changing their opinions constantly, often under provocation and when pressed. So many people read the Born-Einstein letters, I certainly did, because we want to see Einstein. But I invite you to read them looking at Born and what he does and how his views change. At times, and I'll hopefully demonstrate this, it's hard to distinguish which one is speaking. This might seem extraordinary to you, but what happens under closer interrogation is many of the physicists you would so you would identify as card-carrying Orthodox view, subscribers of the Orthodox view, it looks very close to heterodoxy. So, to Alexei Kozhevnikov's remarks, many physicists after 1927 kept commenting, explaining and restating their positions, usually without acknowledging their views continued to shift as the time and situation changed. Not only did the authoritative spokesmen of quantum mechanics disagree with one another, sometimes openly, but often subtly, but even the extant record of an individual prolific writer contains mutually contradictory philosophical declarations which could only be understood within the statement's short-term context. So you respond to Schrödinger here, later you respond to Einstein. Those two responses don't often match up very well at all. To speak of a coherent interpretation is something we intellectual historians do for the sake of convenience. Right. But for a historian's historian, that's simply not good enough. Okay, so take the Solvay Conference. So there's a famous letter that Ehrenfest writes a few weeks after the conference to his students, Uhlenbeck, Gutschmidt and Dierker. And he says, I'm pro-Bohr and contra Einstein. This is quoted over and over again. But read the letter. What he goes on to say is, we have complementarity, which is a lovely provisional view until we get better concepts. And he writes, and I know this would drive Bohr to complete despair. Now, this is precisely what Schrödinger argued just a few months later. Ehrenfest professes himself pro-Bohr, but when you read the details, he's closer to Schrödinger. Interesting. The term, as Anja Jakobsen mentioned earlier this morning, the term Copenhagen Interpretation only appears in the context of post-war debates in the 1950s. I haven't been able to trace it earlier than Heisenberg's contribution to the Bohr-Festschrift in 1955, but there are terms like Copenhagen School that are circulating before this. When Heisenberg coins the term in 1955, there is in fact no widely shared interpretation. The term interpretation in fact gets used much more often after the 1950s. I'm not saying people didn't debate quantum mechanics, but a widely shared interpretation is something I suspect which we have projected back. There was a shared understanding, of course, of how to use the theory. One might call this a minimalist interpretation. We have working rules. Standard quantum mechanics became well understood very rapidly. But this agreement did not extend to a range of foundational questions. I hope to make this plausible, at least, to you in a moment. What passed for the Copenhagen interpretation after World War II was in fact a series of retrospective reconstructions that often went beyond anything we can find in the writings of the people earlier in the 1920s and 30s. So it's not simply that the Born, Heisenberg, Bohr, Pauli disagreed, but they themselves are changing their views at the same time. So it's not enough to say, oh, I'm speaking about the Heisenberg interpretation, not the Bohr interpretation. My response is, Heisenberg when? 1927 or 1958? Because I can assure you the Heisenberg that writes Physics and Philosophy, the Gifford lectures, is one who's gone through a period of philosophical maturation. He's absorbed Kant and rejected Kant, and the naive positivistic utterances are a thing of the past. If you read the accounts of conferences with the logical positivists, you'll see how much Heisenberg detested logical positivism, as did Pauli, from about the mid-30s onwards, whatever their inclinations had been earlier on in life. Very common pattern. The only physicist of that group I can find explicitly endorsing positivism is Jordan, but the positivists disowned him because of very dubious political associations with Nazism. I don't know that I'll go through that. So, what I propose to do very quickly is put up a few passages, see if you can imagine who might have said these, and then I'll show you. So, I'm far from saying that the present interpretation is perfect and final. I welcome Schrödinger's attack against the complacency of many physicists who are accepting the current interpretation because it works without worrying about the soundness of its foundations. It would be silly and arrogant to deny a possibility of a return to determinism, certainly not Bohr, I can give you that. For no physical theory is that final. New experiences might force us to alternatives and revisions. I expect that our present theory will be profoundly modified, but I should never expect that these difficulties could be solved by a return to classical concepts. I expect just the opposite, which we shall have to sacrifice some current ideas and use still more abstract methods. If you've read my chapter, you'll know the answer. The answer is Max Born. Not what you might have expected. Second, my own belief was that Einstein was basically right, but he did not have a sufficiently general mathematical basis. The present quantum theory is an interim theory. It needs to be improved by a new theory of the future. Bohr made the mistake, along with most physicists of his time, of being too complacent about the existing quantum mechanics. He accepted it as basically true and tried to build up a new philosophy, complementarity, to fit with it. But I do not believe nature works on those lines. I won't read the second one in the interest of time. Very similar sentiment. Any guesses? Dirac. Plenty of evidence that Dirac held this view going way back to the 20s and 30s. Apparently, although I'm, as a historian's historian, a bit reluctant to rely on later testimony, but he and Bohr had a week-long discussion about EPR in Carlsberg. And what Bohr often was able to do is prevent the mutiny, but not completely convince, right? So you went silent, but silence is not assent. And so this is where I'm going to come to how do we reconstruct the orthodoxy, having totally dismantled it intellectually. Oh yes, we often contrast the Ensemble interpretation with the Copenhagen Interpretation. Leslie Valentine did that famously in 1970, but a host of historians and philosophers have done that ever since. Actually, to say that that describes the state of one single system, this is the psi function of course, is just a figure of speech. Just as one might say in everyday life, my life expectancy at 67 is another 4.3 years. What that really means, of course, is that you take all individuals of 67 and count the percentage of those who live for a certain length of time. This has always been my own concept of how to interpret psi squared. The description of the physical system by means of a psi function must rely on the fact that in principle only an ensemble description is included in the laws of nature. Who said these? Born and Powell. And if I had more time, I'd show you von Neumann held to the ensemble interpretation as well. In the 1938 Warsaw Conference, he expressly says, it's recorded in the French proceedings, you can only demonstrate the completeness of quantum mechanics if you adhere to ensembles, not expect it to describe an individual system. It's Einstein who keeps saying this of the orthodox view, and we tend to read Einstein, but he's not a faithful representative of the opponent's view. This is what typically happens. I think Jean Bricmont will talk about the comedy of errors. Believe me, it was a widespread comedy. Mutual misunderstanding, left, right and centre. Two more. Forgive me, indulge me. The current view of quantum mechanics may not be the ultimate one. The ultimate one may even revert to the causal form, although most physicists don't think this is likely, but might. While the prevalent taste up until now has been in favour of one of the two interpretations, namely the statistical one, there have been in the last few years some interesting attempts to derive the other, causal interpretation. Quantum mechanics is an example where alternative interpretations of the same theory are possible. Any guesses? You won't guess this one if you haven't seen it. It is von Neumann in the 50s. The same von Neumann who produced the impossibility proof, of course, but he'd been in contact with Bohm since then, right? And if you actually read accounts of von Neumann, even he was a bit iffy about the proof, right? He simply attempted to put into rigorous axiomatic mathematical form what he felt most physicists felt at the time. But actually, if you read Wigner's accounts, von Neumann was a bit less dogmatic than may have appeared, and these, I think, remarkable passages tell us a very different story. Final one, I promise, and then I'll do some analysis, hopefully. There remain some questions about the process of observation itself, questions which we do not have unambiguous answers, because orthodox quantum mechanics treats the concept of measurement as a fundamental one which ought not to be analysed. Therefore, I conclude that the notion of decision or quantum jump or some other concept not contained in the Schrödinger equation is indeed necessary and unavoidable. It's then apparent that the situation, though it's clear in certain respects, does not allow a complete and final analysis. There remain open certain questions, and it seems to me that entirely new conceptions are necessary. Perhaps the real problem is to synthesize the two fundamental notions of quantum mechanics. He earlier discussed this, its waves and probabilities, and unite quantum mechanics still more intimately with thermodynamics. Unable to do so myself, although the preceding aspects of the paper attempt to do this, I should like to emphasise the urgency of further thought upon these questions. Who is this? This is Pascal Jordan. Okay, so I've bombarded you. I've got a million examples like this, but you get the idea. These are statements by authors you would not expect to see these sentiments from if they subscribe, and they are often taken to describe to the orthodox or Copenhagen interpretation. Okay. What do we do? This actually forces the historian to think, what do we mean by this glib reference to orthodoxy? It's actually taken from the history of religion, of course, where you often get prescriptions, or sometimes get prescriptions. There's no manifesto. Orthodoxy, it's obviously a Greek derivative. The correct view, whatever that might be, irrespective of who or how many physicists held to it. Or is it the dominant view, the view held by the majority of physicists, but few people ever bothered to survey? Right. A canonical view, perhaps, we associate with a canonical author. We obviously like to make Bohr the central figure here, but he never uses the term Copenhagen interpretation. That's clearly Heisenberg's invention. But some other people have said, no, Pauli gives a better view, so he's the author of the Copenhagen interpretation. Others say it's Heisenberg, etc., etc. Let me tell you, the attempts to reach consensus on what the Copenhagen interpretation is have, in my view, been nothing short of an abysmal failure. Is it a rational reconstruction? Some have said, don't worry about what the founding fathers actually said, it's the legacy that they left. Of course, what's the legacy they left? I want to know, if it's what we think now, what do we think now? Are we thinking now about what the Copenhagen interpretation was? So their views attributed to Bohr, Heisenberg, Pauli, and the other members of the gang, whatever they themselves may have said. Today it's most commonly used as a rhetorical foil for other interpretations. Invariable, spontaneous collapse theories, Everett interpretations, each of which have their own, incidentally, multiplicity of interpretations. To borrow Quentin Skinner's very evocative phrase, the Copenhagen interpretation turns out to be a history of thoughts which no one ever actually succeeded in thinking at a level of coherence which nobody ever actually attained. This is a common problem in intellectual history. You look at the history of a concept, a political concept or a scientific concept, it often is all sorts of post facto reconstruction operating. What's more interesting, I think, is we often think there was some position to which physicists assented or dissented with nothing in between. You're either for or you're against, and the vagaries of the human rationation processes are left. Now, some physicists did occasionally express themselves excessively dogmatically, but not always. So simple binaries like acceptance and rejection do not do justice to the spectrum of attitudes that physicists, wearing orthodox hats, often expressed at one time or another. How am I doing for time, by the way? More than okay. So we find a range of convictions from cautious optimism to tentative skepticism about the prospects for the standard view, the standard use of quantum mechanics. Satisfaction, so it's often about satisfaction with the theory, which is as much an emotional as an intellectual issue. So you could be satisfied without thinking the theory was the final word, like Max Born. What separates Born and Einstein is not a belief in completeness. As far as Einstein was concerned, Bohr conceded it wasn't complete, but there's nothing of the pathos, the ontological anxiety in Born. It's not completeness, it's I'm not worried. Get on with the business. Orthodoxy and heterodoxy therefore don't appear as polarised attitudes. It's a too simple formulation, at least for me. In fact, Born says to Einstein at one point, I'm inclined to make use of the formalism and even to believe it, in quotation marks, in a certain sense, until something decidedly better turns up. He evidently held out the prospect that a better version might come up. And you find none of the pathos in Dirac either. He says, don't worry too much, we're at a transitional stage. It takes a long time to work things out, particularly given the problems that Dirac felt we were currently experiencing in quantum electrodynamics. He was one of those old guard who was never happy with renormalization in the 40s. This gets us to thinking about belief in and belief that. You can believe in a theory without believing that it represents the final truth. And so I take my cues here from H.H. Price, when he says more or less what I've just said, but much more nicely. One can rely on a theory, one can trust it, but setting out a set of common commitments is not the right way to go here. We're dealing with the vagaries of sort of human attachment to sets of ideas. How does this now threaten to dissolve the whole notion of the orthodoxy? I've grappled with this question for some time, because surely there's something like a resistance, an orthodoxy operating, to which many people in this room are reacting against, of course. And I say not necessarily. But the orthodoxy is not to be found, I would maintain, in a set of interpretive commitments. You can find some people with some interpretive commitments and others with others. Now this might seem a bit simplistic, but let me put forward my own view. It's best understood as a resistance, perhaps even an intransigence on the part of physicists, whether motivated by pragmatic, professional, or philosophical concerns, and those philosophical concerns could be very different in different cases, to any attempt to pursue some kind of reformulation. There are either better things to do, it's a waste of time, or there's some philosophical reason, and they could be different. That would depend on what you think the aim of a physical theory is, and there has never been any agreement on that, whatever we might like to think. Okay, I'm going to skip those next 2 points. In fact, this brings us to one of my last 2 points, public and private. The public utterance and the private confession. In many cases, if you dig deep enough, you find many, many physicists in the 30s, or many more than you might think, with dissenting views or question marks, or did Bohr really get the better of Einstein? I have my doubts, I'm not prepared to pass verdict. You can find Sommerfeld in a letter to Carl Ozanne. I'm not very happy with indeterminate physics, though I acknowledge the legitimacy of Bohr's way of looking at it. Perhaps it can still be overcome by some metaphysics. All physics is metaphysics, according to Einstein. How inelegant, for example, the general theory of relativity would become if one were to take into account the precision of measurement there too. So you find these little private expressions and confessions. And if you look at the oral history interviews, you'll find a lot of these revealed in the interviews with Kuhn, which unfortunately are not pressed further. See, if Isaac Isidore Rabi, you can find Robert Marshak talking about E.H. Kennard's debates with Hans Bethe about quantum mechanics, and of course Eugene Wigner. So scientists can hold heterodox beliefs about fundamental issues in their discipline as long as their research can be taken into account and used by others. And that brings me to my final slide. This brings me to what I think is the nub of the issue: belief and action. Belief tends to, as I've hoped to have shown you, a difficult, slippery, elusive thing. Did all these individuals share the same basic set of beliefs? I've said nothing about wave-particle duality and complementarity. They form the shared lexicon of the so-called Copenhagen Interpretation, but there are myriad different ways in which those terms were understood, departing sometimes quite dramatically from Bohr's own views. Don't be fooled by the terminology, is what I would advise. Action, however, being motivated to do something, to act on your dissatisfaction, to be sufficiently impelled, requires enabling conditions. And I think Flavio's talk very beautifully captured what some of those enabling conditions might be. So it's not simply about belief, it's about being moved or motivated to action. So, to quote Philip Pearl from his How Stands Collapse 2, closet deviance shared by a small but growing, I hope, group of physicists is the belief that standard quantum theory has conceptual flaws. Outright deviance is the temerity to try to do something about it. Perhaps action rather than belief was the true mark of the quantum physicist. So I'll leave it there.
We have time for a couple of questions. Flavio?
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. Many very fascinating citations I didn't know. I wanted to, I'm putting the hat of a physicist now instead of a historian. I've been in a conference not long ago, in 2018, where there was about foundations and more or less in the sphere of influence of quantum information people, where Matt Leifer, British physicist Matt Leifer, gave a talk, what is the Copenhagen-ish interpretation? And he gave some tenets of what he believed to be a Copenhagen interpretation, and there was consensus in that. People recognized to be Copenhagen interpretation. Just to somehow to inform about this, that there is people currently physicists who actually have thought and believe to be Copenhagen interpretation, to counter a bit the idea that it's only a straw man built from others' interpretation to refer as something blurry. So there is some physicists who...
Could I ask a question in return?
Yeah.
Would they imagine that that was a view held by the founding fathers?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So it follows probably in the rational reconstruction program. But just to say that it's not only in the Stroman program that others are called Copenhagen.
They label themselves Copenhagen.
Exactly. So there is people who label themselves and they are aware of what they mean, not just pragmatically saying.
Sure.
It was fascinating, but I wondered why you did not use the terminology instrumentalism to describe what is common ground, perhaps, to people, well, perhaps not Philip Pearl and so on, but you didn't use that term. Is there a reason?
There's a very good reason. Heisenberg turns out to be more a Platonist than an instrumentalist towards the end. And if Bohr was just an instrumentalist, one sees not much need for complementarity. You just be an instrumentalist. Clearly for some, not all, there will be some card-carrying instrumentalists. There's more going on here, and in fact a number of them, I don't have time today, a number of them had strong realist inclinations. So Born, for instance, professors at times, I'm not saying he's entirely consistent, a pretty realist interpretation of the wave function, but not quite what you and I might think of as reality. So many of them, it's a complicated story even there too. Yeah.
I thank you for your quotes, most of which I didn't know, and although I have lots of quotes about, we talk about it this afternoon. But I think the interpretation which you mentioned, the statistical interpretation, is the one in the back of most of the physicists who don't worry about quantum mechanics, and certainly it was the view of Bohr, which you read when you read the Bohr-Einstein letter. I could explain that, but it's quite obvious that they're realists, and they think that when you do a measurement, you learn something that belongs to the system. You learn the property of the system, and the wave function gives the statistical distribution of those properties. And that's a natural view, and if it worked, it would be fine, and it would be nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, the no hidden variable theorems, which physicists usually don't know, show that this is impossible. And I think that's the main problem, if you wish, that people have a view of the wave function, which would be perfectly alright if it was consistent, but Bell, Cohen, and Specker have shown that this is impossible. I mentioned that this afternoon.
There is one, Alexei?
Yeah, just a very short remark that, I mean, this is not just a problem of one sort of Copenhagen. I mean, Darwinists say the same thing. It's
Everyone's a Darwinist.
Yes, and my version of Darwin is the right one.
Yeah.
He claims he's a Darwinist. And of course, it's not what Darwin said.
Of course.
So, and like Marxism.
Newtonianism is another one.
Yeah, so in this sense, kind of probably the answer should be some kind of on a more general level.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's a similar form, kind of why do people construct this kind of imagined authority.
Sure.
Yeah, she mentioned in the book what led between Born and Einstein, and the fact that probably what they were born and he say that you don't understand Einstein, you construct
That's
your
right.
own Einstein.
That's right. You've constructed the dummy Einstein. That's right. Right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And maybe I say many times I try to